What's up, everybody? This is What is Nerd Book Talk Edition. Today we're going to start our first discussion of Alan Moore's graphic novel, Watchmen. JP stepped out for a minute, but he did not get a chance to read the selection for this week, but he promises he'll catch up for next week. But Nick and I are going to be having a discussion about chapters 1 through 4 of Alan Moore's Watchmen. So, really briefly, Nick, before we get into the kind of plot breakdown, what did you think of what we read this week?
I thought it was pretty good. I think it helped that I've seen the movie, so I already know what's going to happen, and I have a basic understanding, so it was easy for me to follow along, because it does jump around quite a bit, but I think it's good. The art actually reminded me a lot of Batman Year One, just the style of it.
Yeah.
I know Alan Moore did The Killing Joke, right?
Yes. Well,
okay.
he wrote it, but he did not draw it.
Didn't draw it, okay.
Yeah.
But I thought the art style was real similar to Batman Year One. But
yeah, it's got like a definitely an 80s look to it, you know?
Right. And I know our listeners probably don't know that the three of us really like the TV series Black Mirror. Mm-hmm. And I feel like Watchmen is basically a Black Mirror episode, like the dark side of superhero comics.
That's interesting.
It just because, most comics, super people are good, superheroes are great, and they save the day and things are good. Well, Watchmen is basically an alternate reality, alternate universe, and the tones and themes are very dark, and where it's pretty much hopeless.
Yeah.
And so to me, it seems like this is a twisted alternate universe of superhero comics where, people really don't like superheroes in the real world, where, in Superman, like, oh, Superman's the best. Well, in this, they're like, man, Dr. Manhattan's killing people, and people don't like that. So,
and rightfully so, because the picture that this graphic novel paints is that inevitably, if we did have superheroes, they would be used by the government as a repressive force,
Right, yeah. And so, do you kind of see what I'm getting at about it being Black Mirror? Just because it's like a twisted, different, darker future than what most people would expect with superheroes.
Yeah, definitely. So, we talked about how the Golden Age superhero stories were very hopeful and optimistic, whereas the modern superhero stories are very dark, and they looked at the world in sort of almost like a cynical way. And so Watchmen is like the comic that kind of kicked that off. Because really, Watchmen, I could be wrong about this, so I'll have to double check. Watchmen came out in 1986, the same year that Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns came out. So we haven't talked about The Dark Knight Returns yet, but we'll get to that in the future. But both of these were like these super mature, edgy comics that came out in a time when, comic books weren't necessarily ever mature and edgy. So these kind of kicked it off. So it's been a long time since I've experienced Watchmen. I read it in high school, along with most of the comics that I've read in my life. I remember watching the movie in college. Nick, did we see the movie together in college?
No, we didn't.
Okay.
I saw it with my wife. She was my girlfriend at the time,
mm-hmm.
and my brother, and I think somebody else. And I don't know what I was expecting from the movie. I think I was expecting an awesome superhero movie, and that's not what it is.
Mm-hmm.
It's a pretty good movie, but I had set the bar real high and was expecting one thing and got something else. And so I kind of walked away with a sour taste in my mouth. I was like, man, that movie's terrible, but I'm glad we're coming back to it.
Yeah.
And kind of with a new appreciation and more of an open mind with what its real message is.
Yeah.
And the tone and the themes.
I remember feeling like the only one of our friends in college that was nerdy enough to actually know what to expect from Watchmen, and because I really liked the movie, and I stand by that, because the movie's kind of gotten a bad rap for basically just copying and pasting the events of the comic and not doing anything else.
Yeah, but to kind of go off that, I mean, I feel like, I mean, that's just critics because I mean, you can't please everybody. They'll say,
Right.
man, it's a copy and paste of the comics, or it wasn't true enough to the comics. You know, they should have. And so it's either that. I mean, you know, this is kind of going off subject, but The Hangover, great movie, hilarious. They came out with Hangover 2. They said, man, this is the same exact movie as The Hangover. I mean, it was pretty much a copy, but it was funny. It was crazy.
And the third one came out, and it was completely different.
And it was completely different. And everybody said, man, this movie sucks. It's completely different. And it's like, you can't win for losing, you know? And I feel like that's just the society we're in. People are going to find things to complain about. And I don't have an issue with a copy and paste because that's the story.
Yeah. Well, and I haven't seen... Well, I know that 300, people loved the movie 300, and that's a copy and paste of the comics for sure. So, I don't know, I haven't seen the Watchmen movie in a long time, but I know that the end is different, which we'll get to that whenever we get to the ending. But to break down what we read this week, we read chapters 1 through 4. Now, the setup, right, is, so in chapter 1, we get an ex-superhero who's now a U.S. government operative named Edward Blake. His superhero name is the Comedian. He's been murdered. This detective-type superhero named Rorschach, he visits the remaining former members of the now-defunct superhero team called the Crime Busters to warn them that somebody may be targeting former superheroes. That's basically what Chapter 1 is all about. It introduces us to the main characters who used to be in this superhero group called the Crime Busters, they're like a Justice League type group of superheroes. And Rorschach is our main character at the beginning, at least.
Yeah, and he's a journal diary thing, and he kind of keeps record of what he's doing, the date, the time.
Yeah, and he has this ink block.
Yeah.
Blot test.
How'd you know that?
Is that JP? Is that JP? Well, welcome to the show, JP.
He has this ink block test
for a face.
Yeah.
Yes.
Really? Wait, does he really do that?
Yeah.
It's his face.
It's his mask.
Yeah. So JP's our resident psychology major, and so Rorschach means ink blot test. So his face, listeners, JP hasn't read the comic, but Rorschach's face is literally like an ink blot.
Oh, interesting.
And it changes all the time.
They show it to emotionally disturbed people, and they're like, what do you see here?
Exactly.
And I think it's a bunch of
baloney.
It's a bunch of... for Dr. Quack out there.
But because that's like an old-fashioned, kind of like an outdated psychology technique, isn't it?
Yeah.
So that's Rorschach's deal, though. He's looking for, and that's the catch with Rorschach is that he actually kind of is a crazy person. He's like a conspiracy theorist, and he excuses kind of like evil behavior from the Comedian as he's still an American hero, even though he did all these terrible things, right?
And one thing I like about Rorschach, though, is that I feel like it's a callback to the old school DC comics where they were detectives. Because since he is a detective, I think that's what makes it so cool, because he's like an old school, noir. Yeah,
he's got the hat and the coat and all that. Mm-hmm. He's kind of like half of Batman, right? He's like the detective side of Batman. He even has a grapple hook that he gets up into windows.
Yeah, and he doesn't really have any superpowers other than his ever-changing face mask, you know?
Yeah.
And so he's an average dude who's super strong and smart, and so that's what I like about him. And he's just real gruff, and he's just trying to get to the bottom of stuff, and that's what I like about him.
Well, and so we also learn in the first chapter that the superheroes aren't active anymore because of something called the Keene Act, which we learn more about later. Now, in addition to this, so we're introduced to the other main characters of the series. We got Night Owl, a.k.a. Daniel Dryberg, who's he's the closest thing to Batman, right? He's got, Night Owl is sort of similar to Batman. He's got a bunch of gadgets and stuff. And whenever we meet him, he's hanging out with an older version of Night Owl. So it's like this older guy, Hollis Mason, had once passed the mantle on down to Dan of Night Owl. And we also learned that Hollis had written a tell-all book about this Golden Age superhero group that he was a part of called the Minutemen. And so I say Golden Age because these guys were around in the 30s and 40s. So that's like a throwback to the golden age of superheroes, basically. You also got Ozymandias, aka Adrian Veidt, who's like a super smart guy. He's almost like if Lex Luthor were a good guy, right, from Superman. And he's basically sold out. He's kind of just become like a brand.
He has his own action figure and everything. And I like how Rorschach basically said, he called him out on it. Like, when he met him, said, "Hey, the comedian's dead," and to warn him that might be somebody out there picking off old superheroes. He says, "Yeah, well, at least he didn't sell out." And then the last 2 frames is Ozymandias. He's just sitting at his desk, and you see these boxes of superhero toys of himself.
It's like obvious that Rorschach is a crazy person. Night Owl is kind of empty, he just kind of hangs out with the old Night Owl, and they talk about the good old days. And you got Ozymandias, who sold out. He's made a lot of money, but it's kind of, he doesn't seem happy. And then you get the other 2 final characters, Laurie Jupiter, aka Silk Spectre, who is in a relationship with Dr. Manhattan, who's the blue dude, right? He's got like basically the powers of God. He's got the ability to manipulate matter, pretty much. And you got, so Dr. Manhattan seems to be busy working on stuff for the government, and whereas Laurie she's cooped up, right? She's frustrated with being around Dr. Manhattan all the time, and he seems to have no interest.
Yeah, and she's there just to basically keep him level-headed and to keep him focused, and basically just to sleep with him.
So he doesn't get like a god complex and do something crazy. Yeah. And she was actually the daughter of another superhero who was a part of the Minutemen she was also called the Silk Spectre, but she the original one passed the mantle down to her daughter. And so whenever Rorschach's talking to everyone about the comedian being killed, they all basically assumed that the comedian had been assassinated by one of his enemies, because the comedian had done a bunch of hitman jobs for the government, basically, and a lot of people didn't like him. Oh, and he was also a psychopath, because he tried to rape Laurie's mom. And then also Laurie and Dan, aka Night Owl, they have dinner because Laurie's getting bored of Dr. Manhattan. And that's basically the first issue, right? Was there anything I missed there, Nick?
No, that's pretty much it. Just Rorschach's the only one who seems to really care that the comedian's dead, and the rest are like, well, we're no longer superheroes, so fun. If you want to solve it, cool, but we're not worried about it.
Yeah. Well, and another thing that's cool about this is the world that it takes place in. So it's an alternate 1985 in which Nixon is still president. It's like, I don't know about doing the math there.
Yeah. Well, I know
several terms.
Yeah, several. And I remember, I don't remember which chapter it is, but it talks about how Nixon was proposing a new bill or new amendment to allow him to run several terms. Yeah. And so, he's the president for forever.
And also, and we also learned that the U.S. won the Vietnam War thanks to Dr. Manhattan. And actually, the fact that Dr. Manhattan exists makes it so that the U.S. is the unquestioned superpower. Because historically, in 1985, the Cold War would still be happening between the U.S. and Russia, but now it's the United States has Dr. Manhattan on their side, who can literally do anything. So basically, Russia has basically lost the Cold War because of this. But the idea of nuclear war is still a threat throughout the entire graphic novel, which we'll kind of get into later. And so, Nick, what's interesting about this, I'm sure that this kind of came as a surprise to you, is that in between each chapter of the graphic novel, there's chapters from a fictional autobiographical book, right?
Yeah, they talk about Under the Hood several times in the first chapter, and so at first I was flipping through the pages, and then it said Under the Hood. It's like, what is this? And it's like, oh, it's the old Night Owl's story. And I'll be honest, I read the majority of the first one, and I kind of skipped through. I didn't read any of the other ones because I'd rather read the comic. But I know there's some backstory and stuff in there, but
well, there's some important stuff, but not a lot. So in the first Under the Hood excerpt, what's interesting is it talks about how the original Night Owl, Hollis Mason, back in the 30s, he was inspired by Superman comics to become a superhero. So Superman exists as a comic book character in the world of Watchmen, which is interesting. And actually, kind of a side note, right now in like DC Comics, they have a crossover between Superman and Watchmen in which their worlds kind of collide, called Doomsday Clock. It's happening like right now.
That's
like they're
pretty cool.
on they're on like issue 11 right now. I haven't read it, but it seems interesting. It's basically like Superman meets Dr. Manhattan. But that's pretty much what you get with the first Under the Hood chapter. He kind of talks about his childhood and stuff, but a lot of that's not super important. He talks about how there's another superhero called the Hooded Justice, which he teamed up with to form the Minutemen, that Golden Age superhero group. All right, now into chapter 2, which is mostly the comedian's funeral, right? So Nick, what strikes you about this chapter that comes to mind?
I mean, really, it seems like it's just a lot more backstory. So all the main characters, well, it's Dr. Manhattan, Night Owl, and Ozymandias. They're basically the only people at the funeral. It's raining, it's night out, it's just a dreary evening, and they just kind of go back and think of their memories and times with the comedian. It gives a lot more backstory on him. And in the meantime, Dr. Manhattan transported Lori to see her mom in the retirement home. And so they depict the mom as an old woman who's sick, and she looks super old. And they said she's 65, and I was like 75 and plus. Like I was like 65 really, and she looks like an old lady. It's like that seems a bit exaggerated. Maybe they should have said she's 80 and be more realistic. Anyways, I digress. But basically, Dr. Manhattan didn't want Lori to be at the funeral, and Lori talks to her mom about her mom almost getting raped by the comedian back in the day, and they show that. And really, it was pretty sad because she's changing clothes. The comedian says, "I know you want it," and she's like, "No, leave me alone." And then basically she slaps him, I think, and then he just punches her right in the gut and starts giving her haymakers, and she's bleeding, and Hooded Justice comes in and says, "What the hell are you doing? Get out of here." And so the comedian runs away, gets punched, and then he says, "For God's sake," puts some clothes on, and just kind of leaves Silk Spectre to kind of leaves her alone. Like, it's pretty depressing.
Right, like she's the one who should be ashamed.
Yeah, I was like, that's pretty messed up. And then basically just shows flashbacks of the comedian, how when they're in Vietnam,
it's the comedian and Dr. Manhattan.
Yes, they're in Vietnam, right? And Dr. Manhattan's, they're saying, "Hey, we're about to leave," and this pregnant Vietnamese woman comes up to him and says, "I'm pregnant, it's your child, and I'm going to America with you." And the comedian says, "No, you're not." She goes, "Yes." He's like, "No." So he pulls out his gun and shoots her and kills her. And then Dr. Manhattan's like, "Why'd you do that?" And he said, "Don't act so holier than thou." He said, "You knew what I was going to do. You could have stopped me. You could have turned my bullets into dust, and you did nothing to prevent that from happening. You're just as guilty as I am." And so you gotta get to see the comedian's viewpoint on the world. I mean, he's a kind of a twisted guy, but he really has no faith in humanity. You flash forward and you see Night Owl, the comedian, basically stopping riots in the streets, and they're trying to keep the people calm, and it's not going well.
Well, it's not even a riot. They're stopping a protest. Yeah. Because the people aren't being violent. They're just discontent for the government, and the comedian starts, shooting tear gas and stuff, right?
Yeah, and they're protesting because they don't feel safe with the Watchmen, because the main thing they keep saying is, "Who watches the Watchmen?" We want our police force back, because there's no longer police because it's the Watchmen. And so they don't feel safe or protected by them, and they don't want these superhero vigilantes running around saying what's right and what's wrong. And so the comedian just, like you said, starts throwing tear gas at the crowd, and just basically says, they don't understand what we do and stuff. And it's just kind of it's really just kind of a heavy chapter. It's, see this guy's life, and it's just really...
He exposes the other characters they're not as messed up as him, but...
They're not perfect at all.
Exactly, because he exposes Dr. Manhattan for, being complicit in allowing the comedian to kill that woman. And then the Night Owl, he kind of points out how Night Owl is a tool of the government, just like he is. It's just the one difference is that the comedian is okay with it, I guess, and like willing to accept that, you know, that the world sucks and that people are terrible, basically.
Right.
And so it's pretty disturbing, I think. But to see a character with this worldview that's kind of unashamed to feel that way is interesting. Okay, so next up we got Under the Hood, section number 2, which again isn't super important. It's mostly first Night Owl writing about how the Minutemen first formed, but on to chapter number 3, in which we get mostly Dr. Manhattan's point of view, right?
Oh yeah. It starts off. Is that the one that starts off where it's Lori laying in bed and she's making love with Dr. Manhattan, and then you see the two hands of Dr. Manhattan on her face, and you see a third hand, then a fourth hand, and she's like, "Wait, what the hell?" And he duplicated himself and said, "I thought you would like this." And she's like, "No." And then it's like he's also like working on stuff. Yeah, there's multiple Dr. Manhattans roaming around, and he says, "I promise all my attention was on you." And I mean, for anybody, that's weird.
It's almost like you're spending time with your significant other, but you're constantly checking your phone.
Yeah.
Your attention is, obviously not on the person that you're supposed to be paying attention to. And I'm sure that this is like the last straw for her, so she storms out, basically, right?
Yeah, so she storms off, and she goes and hangs out with Dan again because she really doesn't have any friends. And when they go out and have drinks, I think, and she says...
Or no, they go out and they get in a fight. Like, they fight a bunch of muggers and stuff.
Yeah, they start... Well, before that, there's talking, and they're saying kind of what Dan does about the good old days and how... Mm-hmm. Like, she says, she doesn't have any friends, and nobody understands what they've been through. And so as they go down this dark alley, and then as they're down this alley, a bunch of muggers come up, and they get in a fight and start beating up all these people. And at the same time before that, Dr. Manhattan's getting ready for a TV show appearance. And so you see scenes of Dr. Manhattan about to go on stage to talk on this TV interview, and then you'll see a few frames of Dan and Lori just beating the crap out of these thugs. And then, so in the interview, they're just talking about things and how he works for the government, but then a reporter comes up and starts asking questions.
Yeah, about how a bunch of people who he's come in contact with have gotten cancer.
Right.
And so obviously they're afraid that since he's got atomic powers, basically, that he somehow, his contact with these people has, made them had cancer. And everyone starts kind of attacking him, so he flips out and basically decides to move to Mars to be away from people.
Right.
And before he goes to Mars, I don't remember if this is in the next chapter or this one, but he stops and gets a photograph from this old bar of himself with his ex-wife, I believe.
Yeah, he actually says, they say, "What are you going to do?" He says, "I'm going to Arizona, and then I'm going to Mars."
Yeah, there you go.
So the people that he's accused of giving cancer are his ex-wife, and she hates him because she's aged and he hasn't. And so she is very resentful towards him.
Well, and also he just left her.
Yeah, that is true. Yeah. That is true. But she just said he couldn't relate to me anymore, and so he left me for Lori, a young Lori. And so she's bitter, as she should be. She has every right to be bitter. And she also has cancer. And then you find out that an old lab partner that worked with Dr. Manhattan, he died of cancer. And you also find out when Rorschach is...
That's right. He interrogates one of their old supervillains that they used to fight, Malak.
He has cancer, yeah. And so all these people have cancer that have been around him, and Lori's mom has cancer. And so all these people that he's been around are having cancer, and they're thinking that he's a link. So yeah, that's when he vanishes, gets the picture, then goes to Mars.
Yeah.
And that's pretty much the story. Just Rorschach's still trying to get to the bottom of everything. And then the U.S. government's pissed at Lori, like, what'd you do? What happened? Because they blame her for him going to Mars. Because, like, well, our big line of defense, being Dr. Manhattan for the U.S., he's gone. He's not even on this planet.
Again, Manhattan was like the deterrent against Russia, right? So now Russia has no reason to be afraid of the United States other than the potential for nuclear war. And so Russia, we learn, like immediately invades Afghanistan after Dr. Manhattan disappears. And so now basically so do you guys heard of the Doomsday Clock? Do y'all know that concept?
Yes, and we're in real life right now, we're like, what, 2 minutes away?
Well, and we've been 2 minutes away for a while, because...
That's a good question. About that? Does that have to do with us destroying ourselves?
Yes, and so basically the world ending due to man-made causes. And so the scientists came up with this back during the Cold War era, basically, whenever nuclear war was a threat. And so whenever nuclear war with Russia kind of like started to reach its peak, the Doomsday Clock would shoot up. But now, for the past several years, it's been at 2 minutes to midnight, because not only like does North Korea working on getting a missile in Iran, but also like climate change. And so the Doomsday Clock thing is a constant theme in Watchmen that's really interesting, because it makes the whole graphic novel seem like shit's about to go down. Like apocalypse is coming. Because in between each chapter, there's like a ticking clock. It gets closer and closer to midnight. So it kind of gives the whole series a real sense of like doom, doesn't it, Nick?
Oh yeah, like it's just like the impending doom that you know what's going to happen, and you're just waiting for it to hit midnight.
Yeah, which is pretty cool. I mean, I love those apocalyptic movies. I don't know why.
And that's why it's an interesting thing to pair. Like, I didn't do this on purpose, but to pair it with Evangelion, because they both deal with like the impending end of the world, basically, right? Because you got in Evangelion, you got the angels invading and stuff like that. So it's kind of got some, it's got some parallels there. But also in this chapter, before we move on to the final chapter, we have the Black Freighter comic, which I thought was interesting. There's that kid who's reading the comic book, and now apparently no one likes superhero comics because superheroes are real. So now everyone just likes pirate comics. And it's like this really brutal like story of this guy who gets marooned on an island, and he has to like bury all of his dead friends and stuff.
I love pirates. Back when I was little.
One thing I wanted to point out, so you talked about the reading this comic, and that's happening all throughout the chapter. It kind of cuts back to this news vendor, and he's all kind of doom and gloom, and he says, you gonna pay for that comic, kid? I mean, the world's he basically says you gotta look up for yourself. Nobody's gonna take care of you and all this and that. And then after Dr. Manhattan leaves, he gets the paper and he puts it up, and also sees that the Soviets are invading Afghanistan. And then at that time, the kid finishes reading that pirate comic, and he goes, "Hey man, kid, just keep it. I'm not going to charge you." And his whole demeanor changes, knowing that, because he thinks the world's about to end.
Yeah, that part's pretty chilling. Like,
yeah, and he goes, go home, go see your family. And he says, something along the lines of, we need to look out for each other.
Yeah.
And, life's too short.
Yeah, so that part's pretty powerful. And, well, so now before we get to our last chapter, we have we have another interlude, Under the Hood number 3. Now, this one actually does include some interesting backstory, basically about how, again, this is the first Night Owl writing his autobiography, about how the United States kind of made heroes illegal. So they made mass vigilantism illegal until Dr. Manhattan and Ozymandias came around, and these guys kind of basically made the Golden Age heroes obsolete, because they were so much advanced compared to them, because obviously Dr. Manhattan had like godlike powers, and Ozymandias was a genius. Superheroes were legal now, and this is whenever the crime busters were created. And so because he felt sort of obsolete, the original Night Owl passed on his mantle to the next Night Owl, who was Dan. And also, like, the idea of superheroes had kind of become normalized, like people had just gotten used to them, and at this point the heroes were basically just a tool of the U.S. government, who just kind of did what the government wanted them to. Now, chapter 4 basically just tells about Dr. Manhattan's origin and how, like in Dune, right? Remember there was the scene that Paul from Dune was, since he knows everything, he's all-knowing, he's omniscient, he is living out of time. Like he's living in the past, the present, and the future. So
sounds kind of like God.
Exactly. Well, and that's what Dr. Manhattan's all about. Is he's basically like a God figure at this point. So Nick, go ahead, take it away.
But that's exactly what I thought about when I was reading this. It's like, this is just like Paul, because he would say, it's 1963, I'm going out to dinner with my wife. It's 1984, I'm making love with Lori. Like he would just jump back and forth like it was nothing.
Yeah, like he's living all these moments at the same time.
Oh yeah. And so, but basically his backstory is he wanted to be a clockmaker like his dad, but then after World War II ended, his dad said, hey, don't fool with clocks, that's nothing, you got to work with bombs now. And so he goes, was it Harvard or no, Princeton?
Some school.
It was some Ivy League school, and he becomes like a chemist, and he's super smart, and he works in a lab, and he meets, what's his wife's name?
I forgot her name.
He falls in love with this woman. They get married, and they're on a date, and her watch falls, and somebody steps on it. He picks it up and goes, oh, I can fix this. And so as a gift, he fixes it, and he says, oh, I meant to give you a watch. I left it in this testing room.
Yeah, the nuclear testing room.
Yeah, nuclear testing room. So he goes in it, and the door shuts behind him, and it locks. And he's like, hey, guys, get me out. And they're like, sorry, John. That's his real name, by the way. Mm-hmm. There's nothing we can do for you. And so he's like, what? And so he basically vanishes in midair.
Yeah, he gets like atomized or whatever and disappears.
Oh yeah, and so he's gone.
He starts like reconstructing. He'll show up and he'll just be like a circulatory system or something like that. And he'll like scare the shit out of everyone.
Yeah, people thought he was a ghost. It was like super creepy. Like at first, like just his eyes would appear, then like his skeleton. Then like as time progressed, more and more of him would start reappearing, and then all of a sudden, boom, he was Dr. Manhattan. Oh, I mean, he wasn't named at the time. They just said, John, you're back as a blue glowing guy. And like, the Blue Man Group won't be formed another several decades, but hey, that's cool. So anyways, he...
completely naked, too. He gets some, he gets some wieners in this comic.
For sure. And so his wife, she's excited. They are happy. But then as time progresses, he starts losing his humanity, basically, and just becomes apathetic to humans. And the whole time he's on Mars, and he's living his memories, seeing his memories with his ex-wife, and then how he plays, basically how he strayed away and started falling for Lori, and then how he joined the Crime Busters and how all that happened. So he's seeing his whole past just simultaneously. It's crazy. And once that happens, apparently he's been putting something on Mars for years because was it been hiding, or he just constructs it?
I thought he just built it just then. Like he's just sitting there and he's like, you know what? I'm gonna build myself a palace on Mars. You know, it reminds me of Frozen. Y'all remember in Frozen whenever she builds herself a castle?
I haven't seen Frozen.
You haven't seen Frozen, Nick?
No, I refuse.
It's okay. I saw it for the first time not too long ago.
I refuse to see Frozen.
But yeah, he just kind of builds himself a palace made out of sand on Mars. And just decides, hey, he's going to live there now. He doesn't want to have anything to do with humans anymore. He's like, okay, they can just destroy themselves for all he cares.
One thing I wanted to say, so earlier I talked about Lori's mom, how she was 65 and looked 92 in the comic. Well, John, when he was 16 years old, working on clocks, when his dad walked in, he looked like 35 in the comic. And I was like, what? He's 16? It's like, get out of here. That's just little nitpicky things I think is kind of funny. But, I mean, it's pretty interesting seeing his backstory. And one thing I liked about it, too, was that it was pretty fast, and it just kept building and rolling. And, like, it just kept just going on, but in a good way, where it felt like madness reading this chapter because it went back and forth so often. Yeah. And so when he's on Mars, he has this picture from Arizona, and he drops it. And throughout the chapter, you see him like holding it in his hand, it on the ground, it's somewhere between him dropping it. It's like just showing that he doesn't have time. It's just there, and he's always in it and throughout it, and that's just who he is. There's things are just the way they are, and he can just jump between it any time and anywhere he wants.
Yeah, it's super cool, and it makes you like understand like how if you were in that position, how like nothing would really seem to matter that much.
Right.
Because it's like you got him, who doesn't care about people anymore because he's like transcended humans, I guess. And then you got the comedian, right, who also doesn't care about people just because he's a nihilist, right? Like he just doesn't believe in good, in the force of goodness. And so, yeah, again, it's like a really bleak outlook, I guess, for both of these characters, but it makes you think quite a bit. And so Nick, did you read the interlude after this one?
No, I didn't.
So I'm gonna break this down a bit, because definitely read this one, because this one's the most interesting out of all the interludes so far. It's this guy, this physicist, who's writing about Dr. Manhattan, basically what his existence means. And so he's got this quote that's pretty interesting. He says, God exists and he's American, which and it's kind of,
I think that's what a lot of Americans believe.
He's got these powers to basically make America the ordained superpower on Earth. But the writer of this article is arguing that not even Dr. Manhattan can stop all of the nuclear weapons on Earth, just because there's so many. Which is true. Like back in the Cold War, I mean, like you heard stories about how there was enough nuclear weapons to destroy the Earth like 100 times over. And so basically he's saying that Dr. Manhattan's existence as being a deterrent for the Soviets is more harmful than good, because the Soviets, given their history of being willing to sacrifice their own people just to prove a point, he says that they're as likely as they ever have been to basically start a nuclear war and destroy the entire planet. Because he talks about in like World War II, right? Joseph Stalin of the Soviets, he literally sent thousands and thousands of soldiers, knowing that they would die. He burned entire cities to the ground just so that whenever the German forces got to these cities, that there would be nothing for the Germans to scavenge for. There'd be no supplies or no crops. So basically saying the Soviets are crazy, they're going to destroy the Earth on purpose. And so he's basically predicting the end of the world. And again, that's all kind of adding to the mood of the apocalypse in this story. And that's where we end for this week. Interesting stuff.
Yeah, it's a lot, but it is pretty good. Mm-hmm. I recommend reading it just because there's a lot to it, but it's not overwhelming, and it is pretty entertaining.
Yeah, and I think that it's a timeless story too. Like I mean, people love apocalyptic stories, right? Even today.
People want the apocalypse to happen. Have you ever seen that show, Doomsday Hunters? People who build their bunkers and stuff. I mean,
right.
Those people want it to. They want to use their bunker.
so they can be like, "I told you so."
Yeah, I know. They are obsessed. Yeah. I mean, that's it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. That's what's scary. Some crazy person out there might be so obsessed with it, they might just go try to end the world somehow.
Sounds like a James Bond plot, if I've ever heard of it.
Yeah, I like the internet, so I don't want the world to end because I like using the internet.
We'll end that episode there. We're going to be covering Watchmen chapters 5 through 8 on our next book talk episode, which will be on next coming Sunday. And then also this Friday we're going to be talking about Neon Genesis Evangelion episodes 10 through 18. Again, if you're listening to this, like these two things pair well together. So catch up with both of them if you've never seen them or read them, or if you're if it's been a while. It's interesting stuff. Anyways, we'll end it there though. If you enjoy what you heard, subscribe to us on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, etc. Give us a like on our Facebook page. Follow us on Twitter at whatisnerd1, and send us an email at winerdcast@gmail.com. We would love to hear your feedback, especially if you have any recommendations on other things we can cover in the future. So, with that being said, we will see you guys next time on What is Nerd Book Talk Edition.